Hi, everyone. Welcome back. Today, we'll be taking a deep dive into compassionate discourse. It's something that's so crucial for good communication and understanding, especially these days when it feels like everyone's at each other's throats. We've got some great excerpts here from Karen Armstrong's 12 Steps to a Compassionate Life to get us started.
Yeah, it's such a relevant topic.
Absolutely. We'll be exploring its historical roots, the philosophies behind it, and most importantly, how we can all actually use compassionate discourse in our own lives to have better and more meaningful conversations, even when things get tough.
Well, one fascinating thing is that the idea of compassionate discourse goes way back in time, like all the way back to ancient Athens. But it wasn't always embraced. Back then, debate was super competitive, almost like a verbal boxing match where the goal was to just totally demolish your opponent with clever arguments and witty comebacks.
And I think I remember reading that Socrates wasn't a big fan of that style of debate at all, was he?
No, not at all. He saw it as unproductive, even malicious. He much preferred a gentler approach, what he called a communal meditation, where people could genuinely engage with each other and, really try to understand different perspectives. But that kind of approach takes a lot of good faith, and you've got to be willing to be challenged.
So it was less about winning and more about opening your mind to new possibilities.
Exactly. And it's really interesting how this same emphasis on compassionate discourse pops up across different cultures and throughout history. Both the Buddha and Confucius championed similar approaches.
It's almost like this inherent human desire for connection and understanding, no matter where we come from. So tell me a little more about the Buddha's approach. I'm curious to hear how it played out in real life.
Well, there's this great story about King Pasenadi of Kosala. The king was really impressed by how harmonious the Buddhist monks were, how peacefully they lived together. And he contrasted that with all the discord in his own royal court. So he went to the Buddha, all frustrated, expecting a lecture or some kind of sermon. But the Buddha surprised him. Instead of launching into a lecture, he just listened. He just empathized with the king's experience.
It sounds like that idea of meeting people where they are, acknowledging their perspective before trying to fix things.
Exactly. And it's so important when dealing with challenging topics, right? Instead of shutting down or lecturing, the Buddha created this shared understanding with the king, like they were all on the same team.
Hmm.
And from that common ground, they could have a real conversation. It shows us that we all want to feel important, like our opinions matter. But true understanding comes from recognizing that everyone else feels that way too.
I love that. It makes so much sense. So we've explored the ancient roots of compassionate discourse, but how do these principles hold up in today's world? Have we learned from the past and created spaces for productive conversations?
Well, I don't know if I'd say we've fully learned our lesson. It often feels like we're right back in those Athenian-style debates,
Right.
only now they're amplified by social media. It's like a constant barrage of opinions and information coming at us from all sides.
Oh, tell me about it. It's exhausting. It feels like everyone's just shouting their opinions into the void,
Yeah,
prioritizing being right over understanding different viewpoints.
yeah. And Karen Armstrong actually shares a personal story in the book that really illustrates this. She talks about how she faced this intense backlash and negativity when she was trying to challenge those stereotypical views of Islam, even though she was doing it to try to promote understanding.
Wow, her attempt to bridge the divide completely backfired. That must have been so discouraging for her.
It was. And it shows us that aggressive debate, that trying to win at all costs, it rarely leads to real change or understanding. It just pushes people further into their own corners and makes that divide even wider.
So how do we even begin to apply these ancient principles of compassionate discourse to our modern world? It feels so daunting, especially when the world seems so divided.
It starts with recognizing that listening, like really listening, it goes way beyond just hearing the words. We have to become really skilled at decoding that underlying message, what's being said between the lines, especially when anger and frustration are involved.
So it's about understanding the context behind the words, the experiences and emotions that are shaping how someone's expressing themselves.
Exactly. And that can be really tough, especially when we encounter viewpoints that are just so different from our own. Armstrong uses the example of fundamentalist movements. She says that a lot of these movements actually stem from this deep-seated fear of annihilation.
That's so interesting. So instead of just dismissing these movements as rational or dangerous, maybe we should try to understand the anxieties and experiences that are driving them.
Right. It doesn't mean we have to agree with those actions, of course,
Hmm.
but recognizing that fear and insecurity often lie beneath these extreme viewpoints can help us start a conversation. And that's where the principle of charity comes in.
Hmm.
It's this idea from linguistics that basically says we should interpret other people's statements in a way that assumes they're trying to be truthful.
Yeah.
That they share our basic understanding of what's true.
Even if their beliefs are totally different from ours.
Yeah. Even then, it's about putting in the effort to understand their perspective, recognizing that everyone, in their own way, is trying to make sense of this world, this really complex world that we all live in.
I love that. And it makes me think about how we can apply this not just in individual conversations, but to entire cultures and nations. How can we foster understanding on a larger scale?
That's a great point. And it leads us perfectly into the next crucial aspect of compassionate discourse, expanding our circle of compassion, moving beyond our immediate circles.
So taking this concept global.
Exactly. In our world, everything's so interconnected.
Yeah.
Understanding diverse cultures and perspectives is more important now than ever.
I get that, but honestly, sometimes it feels easier to just retreat into our own little tribes, surround ourselves with people who think like us. The world feels so chaotic.
I hear you. It's a natural response, but it can be really dangerous. There's this great verse in the Quran that speaks to this. It says, "We have created you all out of a male and a female, and have formed you into tribes and nations so that you may get to know one another."
That's beautiful. Our differences, they're meant to connect us, not divide us.
Exactly. But it's not always easy to navigate those differences.
It reminds me of that whole Salman Rushdie affair. That was such a complex case, with those different cultural conceptions of what's sacred and what's offensive clashing.
Yeah, and it shows how important it is to approach those kinds of situations with, maturity and a willingness to try to understand the other side's perspective. Even when we disagree, we need to recognize that each side might be feeling threatened, like their values are under attack.
It's about trying to empathize, even when it's hard. Recognizing that fear can be such a powerful motivator.
Yes, and recognizing that shared humanity, that common thread that connects us all, even when our beliefs and experiences are worlds apart.
And this makes me think about the role knowledge plays in all of this. How can we move beyond stereotypes and really understand different cultures and traditions?
Knowledge is key. Armstrong's seventh step is called How Little We Know. It reminds us that we often make judgments based on really limited information.
Yeah, it's like that saying, a little knowledge is a dangerous thing.
Exactly. To combat that, Armstrong suggests that we actively seek out accurate information about other cultures and religions. Don't just rely on what you hear or assume. She even gives some practical exercises to help with this.
Okay, tell me about these exercises. I'm intrigued.
So one exercise is to regularly engage with a foreign culture. One that you find interesting. It could be through books, movies, music, food, whatever sparks your curiosity.
It's like making a friend from another culture through their art or literature.
Yeah. And the other exercise she suggests is to read books that challenge your own viewpoints, especially on those hot button issues. If you have strong opinions about something, try to find perspectives that make you uncomfortable, that make you question what you think you know.
It's like breaking out of those echo chambers we can get trapped in online, right? Being willing to have your mind change.
Exactly. That open-mindedness is so crucial for cultivating true compassion and understanding.
This makes me think about those moments of recognition, those times when we see ourselves reflected in another person, even someone from a completely different background.
Yeah, that's such an insightful observation. And Armstrong tells this really powerful story that illustrates this perfectly. It's about Christina Noble and her work with the At Least Street Children.
Tell me about Christina. I'm interested to hear her story.
Well, Christina had a really tough childhood. She grew up in poverty, faced abuse and neglect, and for a long time, she just couldn't deal with other people's pain. It brought up too much of her own trauma.
I can understand that. It's like she was trying to protect herself from being hurt even more.
Yeah. But then, while she was visiting Vietnam, she had this incredible moment of recognition. She saw this group of street children, and it triggered all these overwhelming emotions. She even tried to walk away because it was so intense. But then, she realized she saw herself in these kids. Their suffering mirrored her own in a way.
So what do you think motivated Christina to act, despite her own traumatic experiences?
It was that moment of recognition. Seeing herself in their pain, it unlocked her compassion. And that's when she decided to dedicate her life to helping them. She founded an orphanage and started this foundation that's transformed so many lives.
Her story is so powerful. It reminds me that acknowledging our own vulnerability can be the key to connecting with others.
Absolutely. Christina's story embodies that Buddhist concept of, what is it? the inability to bear the sight of another's sorrow. It's about recognizing that someone else's suffering is just as real and significant as our own. And that understanding, that's what motivates us to take action. And that brings us to another really important part of compassionate discourse, and that's actually taking action.
So it's not just about feeling empathy, but about actually doing something to help, alleviating suffering in some way.
Exactly. And these actions don't have to be like huge life-altering things. Even those small acts of kindness in our own communities, they can make a real difference.
I love that. It's like the ripple effect, right? A little bit of compassion can spread outwards, and inspire other people to be kind too.
Exactly. And Armstrong, she talks about how engaging in these acts of compassion can actually make us happier. Like it can lead to greater fulfillment in our own lives.
That's interesting. So it's not about sacrificing ourselves for others, but more about realizing that helping others actually benefits everyone.
It is, yeah. It's like this win-win situation. Remember Christina Noble? I mean, think of the work she was doing. It was incredibly difficult and emotionally draining, but it never seemed to get her down. If anything, it seemed to make her even more joyful.
Yeah, it's like compassion has this energy of its own, it
Hmm.
brings its own sense of fulfillment. It's really beautiful. And it reminds me of those biblical stories Armstrong talks about, those compassionate encounters.
Oh, right. Those stories are so rich with meaning. Like the story of Abraham. He welcomes these three strangers into his tent, right?
Right.
Offers them food, water, rest. Doesn't even hesitate.
And then, as the story goes, it turns out those strangers are actually God or some kind of divine manifestation, right?
Yeah, it's not explicitly stated, but that's definitely the implication. And what's interesting is that it's Abraham's, that radical hospitality that opens him up to that divine encounter.
It's like a reminder that being compassionate can lead us to these unexpected, even profound experiences.
Totally. And then there's the story of the disciples on the road to Emmaus. They're grieving. They've lost Jesus, and they meet this stranger. And the stranger walks with them and comforts them and offers them all this wisdom by, like, interpreting the scriptures.
And if I remember correctly, they don't even realize it's Jesus at first.
Right. They're just drawn to his, compassion and wisdom. And then later, when he breaks bread with them, that's when they finally recognize him.
What a powerful image,
Yeah,
It's like compassion can reveal itself in these unexpected ways, even through people we don't necessarily recognize right away.
it can. And finally, there's the story of Jacob wrestling with the stranger.
Who also turns out to be God, if I'm not mistaken. There seems to be a theme here of biblical figures wrestling with the divine.
There is. But in Jacob's case, that struggle, it actually leads to a blessing. And it leads to him reconciling with his brother Esau.
So even those difficult encounters, those struggles, they can ultimately lead to growth and healing, but only if we approach them with a compassionate heart.
Exactly. And this brings us to what might be the toughest part of compassionate discourse: loving our enemies.
Okay, yeah, this is where things get really interesting and maybe a little tricky. I mean, how do we even begin to wrap our heads around that concept?
Well, Armstrong frames it in the context of the Golden Rule. Treat others as you'd like to be treated. It's about recognizing that shared humanity, even with the people we see as threats or enemies.
So it's about going beyond that whole us versus them mentality. It's about recognizing that we're all part of this one big human family.
Exactly. And remember, Lao Tzu's teachings in the Tao Te Ching, he talks about how force can be so self-destructive, and how important restraint and humility are, especially for leaders.
And I'm also thinking about Jesus's teachings, like loving your enemies and turning the other cheek. I know that can seem kind of counterintuitive, especially when we've been hurt or wronged, but I'm seeing a connection here.
You're right. There's a definite connection. Both Lao Tzu and Jesus, they're advocating for this different kind of strength, what we might call soft power. True strength, it's not about aggression or domination. It's about compassion and understanding. So turning the other cheek, it's not about being weak. It's about disarming that hostility so that understanding and, reconciliation can happen.
It's about breaking that cycle of revenge and violence that seems to be everywhere.
Exactly. And there are some amazing examples of people who embody this radical forgiveness, even when they've been through horrible things. Nelson Mandela and the Dalai Lama come to mind.
Yes. They both faced such incredible hardship and oppression, and yet they chose to respond with compassion.
Yeah, and they both talk about how important forgiveness is for creating a more peaceful world. And of course, we can't forget Martin Luther King Jr. He was such a powerful voice for love and forgiveness.
His words are so relevant. Even today, he said, "Only goodness can drive out evil, and only love can overcome hate." That's not just some idealistic phrase. I think it's essential for our survival as a species. So we've talked about the theory of loving our enemies, but what about the practical side of things? How do we actually do it? How do we engage with our enemies in a way that's compassionate and constructive?
Armstrong gives us some really helpful steps to guide us. First, she says we have to be honest with ourselves about how hard this can be, acknowledge our own hatred and reluctance.
It's like saying, okay, I'm angry, I'm scared, this is really hard, but I'm going to try anyway.
Right. And she also tells us to make a distinction between individuals and their leaders. It's so easy to just demonize an entire group of people based on the actions of a few.
Avoiding that us versus them trap is so important.
It is. And she suggests trying to understand our enemy's history,
Yeah.
their experiences of suffering.
It's like trying to find that shared human experience, even if it's rooted in pain. It's recognizing that hurt people hurt people.
Yeah. And she reminds us to consider, whether our own nation or group might have played a role in their suffering, taking responsibility for our own actions and recognizing that we're not always the good guys.
It's humbling to realize that we all have our own baggage, our own traumas, and those wounds, they can manifest in really harmful ways.
They can. And
Mhm.
so she encourages us to use that principle of charity when we're trying to understand the enemy's actions. Make a real effort to understand their motivations, how they see the world,
Mm.
and then really listen to their stories, their narratives of pain. Try to see things through their eyes.
This all sounds like a lot of work, but it's also incredibly powerful. Are there examples of people actually putting this into practice? People who have successfully engaged with their enemies and made a positive impact?
Oh, definitely. Armstrong talks about Thich Nhat Hanh, a Buddhist monk from Vietnam. During the Vietnam War, he meditated for the well-being of both the Vietnamese and American soldiers.
Wow. He didn't take sides. He just saw the humanity in everyone, even in the middle of all that violence and chaos.
He did. He transcended that whole idea of enemy.
Yeah.
He recognized that inherent worth and dignity in each person. And there are these groups of Israeli and Palestinian parents who've lost children in the conflict, and they're working together for peace now. Their shared grief has become this bridge. It's helping them understand each other and work toward reconciliation.
That is so inspiring. It's amazing to see compassion breaking through in those darkest of circumstances.
It is. And there are so many people working for peace between India and Pakistan, two countries with such a long history of conflict.
It's just incredible to see people choosing compassion and understanding, especially when it feels like the world is pulling us in the opposite direction.
Yeah, it's really incredible. These stories show us that compassionate discourse, it's not about being naive or
Yeah.
passive. It's about actively working toward, a better world, a more peaceful world, a more just world.
Sounds like a real call to action, like a challenge to step outside of our comfort zones and actually put these ideas into practice.
Right. And, Armstrong, she leaves us with this really thought-provoking image. She brings in Homer's Iliad.
Ooh, I love the Iliad. What part is she talking about?
Well, it's not the whole epic. It's just this one specific scene. Remember King Priam, the Trojan king? He goes to Achilles to beg for the return of his son's body, Hector's body.
Oh, yeah. That scene is heartbreaking, but it's also so powerful. Priam humbling himself before the man who killed his son. And then Achilles, he actually shows Priam mercy and compassion.
Exactly. In that moment, they stop seeing each other as enemies. They're not caught up in that conflict anymore. They're just two human beings united by grief and loss. And Armstrong, she asks us this question. How can we cultivate that kind of courage and vulnerability? The courage and vulnerability to see the humanity, the sacred mystery in the people we see as our enemies.
It's like she's challenging us to look past those labels that divide us, those categories, and see the common humanity that connects us all.
Yeah, and this challenge, it's not just for, global conflicts. It's for everything, our everyday interactions.
So whether we're arguing about politics or dealing with a difficult family member or even just, that annoying coworker, we can all benefit from practicing compassionate discourse.
We can. It's about bringing that willingness to listen and empathize to every interaction, no matter how challenging it might be.
This has been such a thought-provoking deep dive. I feel like I have a lot to think about and some really concrete tools to try out in my own life.
Me too. It's a good reminder that, even the smallest acts of compassion, they can make a difference. They can ripple outwards.
And to everyone listening out there, we encourage you to keep exploring these ideas. Check out Karen Armstrong's book, try out those exercises we talked about, and most importantly, start practicing compassionate discourse in your own life.
Yeah, you might be surprised at what happens, the connections you make, the understanding you find, both within yourself and with others.
Thanks for joining us on this amazing deep dive. We'll be back soon with another fascinating topic.
Until then, be kind to yourselves
Mm.
and to each other.